Hello and welcome everyone to this week's session of the Bitcoin Optech newsletter reading. And then in this session, we'll be discussing newsletter number 285 published on 17th of January. I'll commence with the preface of the letter, which says, this week's newsletter discloses a past vulnerability affecting core Lightning, announces two new soft fork proposals, provides an overview of the cluster mempool proposal, relays information about an updated specification and implementation of transaction compression, and summarizes a discussion about Miner Extractable Value, that's MEV, in non-zero ephemeral anchors. Also included are our regular sections with the announcements of new releases and descriptions of notable changes to popular Bitcoin infrastructure. So the first segment is the news, and the first among them is disclosure of past vulnerability in core Lightning. Matt Morehouse used Delving Bitcoin to announce a vulnerability he had previously responsibly disclosed that affected core Lightning versions 23.02 through 23.05.2. More recent versions of 23.08 or higher are not affected. The new vulnerability was discovered by Morehouse following up on his prior work on fake funding, which he also responsibly disclosed. See newsletter number 266. When retesting nodes that had implemented fixes or fake funding, he triggered a race condition that crashed CLN with about 30 seconds of effort. If an LN node is offline, it can't defend the user against malicious or broken counterparties, which puts the user's funds at risk. Analysis indicated that CLN had fixed the original fake funding vulnerability, but was unable to safely include a test for it before the vulnerability was disclosed, resulting in the subsequent merge of a plugin introducing the exploitable race condition. After Morehouse's disclosure, a quick patch was merged in CLN to prevent the race condition from crashing the node. For more information, we recommend reading Morehouse's excellent full disclosure blog post. So basically, CLN, like we know, is an implementation of the Lightning Network. All right, and Matt Morehouse, who's a Lightning developer, discovered a vulnerability, which is a race condition, which persisted between these versions 23.02 and 23.0.5. Now, what this vulnerability is a race condition between the channel open flow and the peer flow. There is a diagram in his blog that will help us understand it better. All right, yeah. So the race happens between the channel open flow and the peer connection flow. All right. So the CLN basically has daemons that run in the background that are assigned multiple tasks. So, right, there's this connect D daemon, there's this lightning D daemon, there's this opening D daemon, there's this channel D daemon. Connect D daemon, what it does is that it, any peer that is trying to connect with your CLN node, it passes off the information to Lightning D. And Lightning D is like the heart or the backbone of the entire ecosystem. It basically delegates tasks to other daemons. Opening D opens the channel, and channel D is the daemon that manages the state of the channel. So every time a node wants to establish a connection with your node, connect D is the first node that gets triggered. Okay, and it passes out the information to Lightning D, as mentioned, peer open channel, and then Lightning D passes on this information to opening D that opens the channel using this process, open channel, action channel, funding created. Okay, and once the channel is opened, channel D is another daemon that is assigned with the task of maintaining, managing, and updating the state of the channel. So this is one flow. This is the channel open flow. Now there's another flow, the peer connection flow. When a peer tries to establish a connection with your node, all right, again, more or less the same process happens. Connect D notifies Lightning D. Lightning D then notifies Chan backup. What is Chan backup? It's basically a hook that backs up the state of a channel. Like for instance, if two nodes were connected and for some reason they disconnected and they decide to connect back again, this Chan backup hook, what it does is it reverts or it restores the state at which they were when they disconnected. And then again, once the old state is restored, then we go back to channel D, which again manages the state of the channel. Now, when could a race condition between these two flows happen? It could happen when a node connects with another node and immediately opens up a channel. So there are two requests that are sent subsequently within a very small amount of time, the peer connection flow and the channel flow. Both these flows are triggered in a very small amount of time as shown here. All right. So connect D is notifying Lightning D that a peer wants to connect, and simultaneously or subsequently within a very short period of time, it is also informing Lightning D that the peer wants to open a channel. Now what happens is we know what this flow is, peer connect flow, and then this is the open channel flow. What happens is that Lightning D now tries to launch channel daemon twice. Channel daemon, as we know, is a daemon that is responsible for maintaining the state of the channel. Okay, so it's triggered when you open a new channel, and it's also triggered when two peers get disconnected and they get connected again. So what Lightning D here is trying to do is it is triggering channel D twice, one for the connection flow and once for the channel open flow. Now what happens is that two channel Ds, that is channel daemons, are being summoned simultaneously for the same channel, which can lead to assertion failure because one channel can only have one channel daemon that manages its state. Okay, but what is happening because of the channel open message and because the channel open message and the peer connection message are being triggered subsequently, two channel daemons are being opened simultaneously, which can lead to an assertion failure. Now, I think 3 weeks ago, we discussed a very similar vulnerability that was disclosed in LND, which was a race between the channel announcement message and the channel update message. And this is very similar. In fact, in that session, we were discussing that whether this vulnerability is specific only to LND or this also happens with some other implementations of the Lightning Network, and we decided we'll research on it. So, like they've covered it in one of the future Optech newsletters, and that is the one that we're reading, that this vulnerability, this race, also happens in CLN. And the consequence is the same, the node crashes. When the node crashes, when the node is offline, there is a high possibility in the Lightning Network for the user to lose their funds. So this is a vulnerability that has been fixed now, okay, because the CHAN backup takes some more time than it used to retrieve the state, and by that time the channel daemon is already open. So these two channel daemon processes do not happen very subsequently. Once the channel is already open, the CHAN backup then retrieves the information, the previous stored state of the channel, and then the same channel daemon is assigned the task to manage that state that has been retrieved. Now, this is an old disclosure, all right? It's not relevant anymore because in the recent version 23.08, it has been fixed. So broadly, what Matt Morehouse brought to our attention is that a race condition used to occur between these two versions of the software, which led to the crashing of the node, and it has been amended now. So it's more now for educational purpose and warding off for future attacks, but it is not relevant anymore because nodes have upgraded. Okay, so like, can anybody? I'll come to the questions if anybody has any questions. But can anybody come up with a response as to why is this vulnerability disclosed now when it has already been sorted and tackled, and not when it existed? Why did it take time for the developers to come out after the vulnerability has been sorted out and disclose it to the public? Any guesses? It's not a threat anymore, and they're talking about it now.
I mean, if they disclosed it earlier before the fix was released, anyone could exploit it. So
yes, great, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, like the developers have to be very sensitive about it, because if these things are leaked in public, it's very easy for somebody to exploit it. So generally, vulnerabilities are kept very confidential, and they are only released out in public for like educational purpose or for warning off such vulnerabilities in the future after they've been fixed. And there's a new mechanism that's been proposed by Lightning developers, which will allow the users to share the vulnerabilities that they come across with the Lightning developers in a very confidential manner, and we'll cover that mechanism as well in today's session itself.
So in simpler language, like this race condition. Yeah. So my question was, in a simpler language, like this race condition might have led to what kind of vulnerability? Like what could have happened in payment channels, which is
your node will crash when the Lightning D tries to summon channel daemon twice for the same channel. The node will crash. And once the node crashes, your node is offline. And when your node is offline, firstly, you can't route payments, so you miss out on your routing fees. Secondly, it's possible that somebody could broadcast a revoked a revoked commitment transaction. Okay,
Perfect.
and before
Yeah.
your note comes back online, that HTLC might expire and the revoked a commitment transaction might get mined and you might lose your funds or you might end up getting duped and cheated.
Perfect. Thank you. Mango, you had a question too. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I think these are called zero-day vulnerability, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
Okay, Anmol answered you. I wasn't aware. Thanks, Anmol. Cool. The new one is the new LNHANCE combination soft 4 proposed by Brandon Black. Brandon Black posted to Delving Bitcoin details about a soft fork that combines previous proposals of Optech template verify at CTV and Optech checksig from stack CSFS with a new proposal for an opt internal key that places the taproot internal key on the stack. Authors of scripts must know the internal key before they can pay to an output, so they could directly include an internal key in a script. However, opt internal key is a simplified version of an old suggestion from CTV's original author, Jeremy Rubin, to save several virtual bytes and potentially make scripts more reusable by allowing the value of the key to be retrieved from the script interpreter. In the thread, Black and others describe some of the protocols that would be enabled by this combination of consensus changes, LN symmetry, ARC-style join pools, reduced signature DLCs and vaults, without pre-signed transactions. Among other described benefits of the underlying proposals, such as CTV-style congestion control and CSFS-style signature delegation. As of this writing, technical discussion was limited to the request about what protocols the combination proposal would enable. So section or bullet point from the news basically covers three things. It revolves around CTV, which is an opcode. It revolves around CSFS, which is also an opcode, and it revolves around opt internal key, which is also an opcode. These are three proposed opcodes, and the combination of them is being referred to as LNHANCE by Brandon Black, who is like championing this LNHANCE soft fork. There's very little content available about it on the internet anywhere. You'll probably find a few tweets or a tweet thread maybe on this guy's Twitter timeline, Brandon Black. He's the only one who's like vociferously talking about it. And I think this was the first time that he ever went on air and spoke about it. So there's very little content available on the internet except for what's available on the Bitcoin Optech podcast session for the newsletter that we're reading and some of the tweets that he shared about. Now, broadly, what is CTV? I mean, it's very much talked about. CTV is Optech template verify. What this does is that one of its features or one of its primary use case are referred to as covenants. It allows you to restrict the output of a transaction. Up till now, you have the provision or the authority to lock the input of a transaction, right? If person A owns UTXOs and person A sends those UTXOs to person B, person A only has control over those UTXOs till they are in his possession. The moment he unlocks those UTXOs and sends it to person B, person A has no control over it. Okay. Now it's absolutely person B's prerogative. So person A can only control the input of the transaction, not the output. The output will be controlled by person B. What covenants does is that it gives the provision for person A to control even the output of the transaction. Okay. So when person A owns those UTXOs, obviously it is known, this is like the default behavior in Bitcoin, that person A will decide to whom he wants to send those Bitcoins, how much he wants to send, what time lock he wants to apply, how much fees he wants to pay, right? But even after the UTXO goes to person B, person A can still determine or decide how person B will spend them once it reaches person B. In fact, if person B wants to send it to person C, who wants to send it to person D, person A can determine how person B will spend it and how person C will spend it and how person D will spend it, all right, as long as a person B agrees with it. This is like restricting the output of a Bitcoin transaction, which is a novel concept. And this might have lots of use cases, one of which could be like, for instance, there is, let's say, an exchange who is sending Bitcoins to your custodial wallet or maybe your hot wallet, whatever. But you are afraid that somebody might hack into your wallet and steal your funds. So you tell that that exchange, hey, this is my address. You send the funds to this address, but once the funds reach me, again lock them that the funds cannot be further spent to any address other than my own address. So even if somebody gets into my wallet and tries to hack the wallet and tries to send the funds to their own address, the funds will not go except to my address. Or you can apply any other kind of mechanisms, like you can time block them. Once they reach me, I will only be able to spend them after 2 months, or once they reach me, I will only be able to spend 10% of the UTXO, 20% of the UTXO. So you can stipulate conditions and restrict the outputs of a transaction. This is broadly what the concept of governance is. And this is done by a template, all right, where the recipient will draft a template and tell the sender that, hey, this is the template, send me coins. Once the coins reach me, I will only be able to spend them if I align with this template. I have stipulated some conditions in this template, and once the bitcoins reach me, I will only be able to further spend these bitcoins if I comply with the rules or the terms and the conditions that I have specified in this template. And that's why it's referred to as check template verified. Okay. So the catch here is that it's only the recipient that can draft that template. So person A can decide how person B will spend the coins once they reach person B, but it is person B who will draft the template, stipulate the conditions, and give it to person A. All right. So the authority is still in the hands of person B. The second opcode that is being talked about is check sig from stack. All right. We all know what op check sig is, right? It's the default opcode in Bitcoin for verifying digital signatures, right? What op check sig takes is that it takes in 3 parameters, and you all know that it needs a public key, it needs a digital signature, and it needs a message. All right. So what it does is that it verifies that the public key is derived from the same private key which is used to sign the message, right? Well, the catch here is that the message in Optech sig, the opcode that we've all been using, can only verify whether a Bitcoin transaction has been signed, right? So that message has to be the Bitcoin transaction. You can only sign a Bitcoin, you can only verify the Bitcoin transaction, not any arbitrary data, all right? What Optech sig from stack does is that it gives you the provision to verify arbitrary data. So even other than the transaction, if you want to put something on a Bitcoin script, it could be anything, and you want to verify that the digital signature on this arbitrary data is created from the private key from which the public key has been deduced, you can do that. All right. So the primary difference between opchecksig and opchecksig from stack is that opchecksig can only use the Bitcoin transaction as a message, but opchecksig from stack can verify the authenticity of any arbitrary data that's put on the script. The third one is op internal key. This basically has to do with taproot. All right. This concept of aggregated public keys. We had a session with Saravanan as well, in which we discussed music. So music is a mechanism through which you can aggregate public keys, right? So let's say if there is a 5 of 3 script where 3 people can sign it, one way is that 3 people individually share their public keys, all right? The second way is that 3 people combine their public keys and generate an aggregated public key. And with that single aggregated public key, you can sign the transactions, okay? So that is referred to as internal public key. And this is generally the most common combination. Like if 5 people own a UTXO in a 5 out of 3 account, then maybe you know that these 3 people, you can choose any 3 people who will most commonly sign the transaction, or who have the highest probability of signing the transaction. So you aggregate their keys and make it an internal key, so that you know that these 3 people are primarily, or there's a very high possibility that these are the 3 people that are always available to sign the transaction. So you aggregate their keys and make one key out of their keys, which is known as the internal key. Okay, so this is op internal key. What does op internal key do? It just fetches the internal key and it puts it on the script. Okay. Now, what is the combination of these 3 things? I mean, the combination of these 3 things are referred to as LNHANCE. Okay. So if these 3 opcodes are incorporated in a Bitcoin core, what can be done is that firstly, governance can be enabled. All right. Secondly, when you're paying to a taproot, op internal key or internal key basically occupies 32 bytes in the witness. Okay. And you might not always use the internal key, right? Let's say you believe that those 3 people have a high probability, but for some reason those three people are not signing, other 3 people are signing. So you're not using your internal key. But the space for the internal key occupies 32 bytes in the witness data. So instead of wasting that 32 bits of space, the proposal says that what we will do is we will hash the template, right? The template that I just spoke about, the template that restricts the output of a transaction. We will hash that template using SHA-256, which is again 32 bytes. And then we will put that template in place of the internal key, all right? And then we will use check sig from stack to verify the authenticity of that template, right? Because check sig from stack can verify the authenticity of any arbitrary data that's put on the script. Okay, so that will verify. Op internal key will pull out that internal key and put it on the script. Check sig from from stack will verify the authenticity of that template, whether the template has been created from the same private or has been signed using the same private key whose public key is being used to receive the funds. So this combination is basically referred to as LNHANCE. These three opcodes, Optech, template verify, Optech sig from stack, and op internal key. Okay, one of the use cases I mentioned is governance, and there are other use cases as well, such as congestion control, transactions, and some other I mentioned here. They might be handy in LN symmetry, arc-side join pools, DLCs, walls. Now, there is some discussion around whether this should go ahead or no, because some people believe that arbitrary data should not be signed on the Bitcoin scripts because people might misuse them. So like this is like a debate going on, but broadly this is what LNHANCE is. For more information, or if you want to dig more into it, you can probably go through, listen to the podcast, or read the transcript of the podcast, or just go to the timeline of this person, Brandon Black. All right. Yeah. So any questions about op CTV or op CSFS or op internal key or anything related to that?
Hey, that was a great explanation, by the way, Faisal, because I have been trying to understand how OptCTV does what it does, and you explained beautifully what covenants are. My question is regarding internal key. So, what exactly is the purpose of doing that? So, Music helps you aggregate public keys so that you only need one public key instead of when signing a transaction, instead of giving the whole 3 public keys, you can just give 1 public key. Is that correct? Is that the use case?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
It's
And
basically to save space, is it?
yes, it does. Instead of using 3 public keys, you now use 1 public key.
Right. Got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
And there's this series of videos by Tadrija. I think that's how his name is pronounced. I'm not very sure. And I think even Setu shared one of his videos with me long back regarding electric curve cryptography. So in that, there is a chapter dedicated to Taproot. All right, I'll probably share the link in which he talks in detail about what internal keys are. Right, so I'll try and access that video today or tomorrow, and I'll share it, so you can better understand what op internal key is, what is the purpose of it. All right, we'll move on to the next one. Proposal for 64-bit arithmetic soft fork. Chris Stewart posted a draft BIP to Delving Bitcoin for enabling 64-bit arithmetic operations on Bitcoin in a future soft fork. Bitcoin currently only allows 32-bit operations using signed integers, so numbers over 31 bits can't be used. Support for 64-bit values would be especially useful in any construction that needs to operate on the number of satoshis paid in an output, and that is specified using a 64-bit integer. For example, join pool exit protocols would benefit from amount introspection. As of this writing, discussion was focused on details of the proposal, such as how to encode the integer value, what Taproot upgrade features to use, and whether creating a new set of arithmetic opcodes is preferred to upgrading existing ones. This is pretty straightforward. Like, it's just a proposal that will enable arithmetic operations over like 64-bit numbers in Bitcoin, because that is how we measure satoshis. So if you want to perform any mathematical operations in satoshis to avoid overflows in the future, this guy Chris Stewart has proposed that we replace the existing opcodes that add arithmetic opcodes, add, which obviously adds, opdiv, which divides, opsub, which subtracts, and opmul, which multiplies, are currently used for operations over 34-bit integers. And the plan is to upgrade them to 64-bit. And one additional feature they plan to add is that it will check for overflowing before performing arithmetic operations. Like, for instance, if you're dividing something with 0 using opdiv, then the result is obviously going to overflow. So in that case, it'll check for overflows, and they plan to replace the current opcodes, arithmetic opcodes, which are 32 bits by 64 bits. That is correct. All right, cool. So this is an overview of cluster mempool proposal. So Has Daftar posted a summary of the cluster mempool proposal to Delving Bitcoin. Optech attempted to summarize the current state of cluster mempool discussion in newsletter number 280, but we would strongly recommend reading the overview by Daftar, which is one of the architects of the proposal. One detail we have not previously covered caught our attention. CPFP carve-out needs to be removed. CPFP carve-out, a mempool policy added to Bitcoin Core in 2019, attempts to address the CPFP version of transaction pinning, where a counterparty attacker uses Bitcoin puts limits on the number and size of related transactions to delay consideration of a child transaction belonging to an honest peer. The carve-out allows one transaction to slightly exceed the limits. In cluster mempool, related transactions are placed in a cluster and the limits are applied per cluster, not per transaction. Under that policy, there's no way to ensure a cluster only contains a maximum of one carve-out unless we restrict the relationships allowed between transactions relayed on the network far beyond the current restrictions. A cluster with multiple carve-outs could significantly exceed its limits, at which point the protocol would need to be engineered for those much higher limits that would accommodate users of carve-outs but restrict what regular transaction broadcasters can do, an undesirable proposition. A proposed solution to the incompatibility between carve-out and cluster mempool is V3 transaction relay, which would allow regular users of V1 and V2 transactions to continue using them in all the historically typical ways, but also allow the users of contract protocols like LN to opt into V3 transactions and enforce a restricted set of relationships between transactions and its topology. The restricted topology would mitigate transaction pinning attacks and could be combined with nearly drop-in replacements for carve-out transactions such as ephemeral anchors. It's important that a major change to Bitcoin Core's mempool management algorithms take into account all the ways people use Bitcoin or may use it in the near future. So we would encourage developers working on software for mining wallets or contract protocols to read Daftar's description and ask questions about anything that's not clear or which might adversely affect how Bitcoin software will interact with cluster mempool. Just give me a few seconds, guys. Yeah, sorry. This section talks broadly about cluster mempools. We discussed cluster mempools, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And what's cluster mempool? When a transaction is included in a block, all of us know that it's not randomly included. There is a mechanism to it. There is an algorithm to it which incentivizes the miners. Okay. Now, what this algorithm is, it basically takes into consideration the ancestors of the transaction. If there is an unconfirmed transaction in the mempool, the fee of that transaction and the fee of its ancestors will be taken into consideration while including that transaction in the block. So the transaction that has the highest absolute fee of itself and its unconfirmed ancestors will be taken inside the mempool. While when you try to expunge, or when a transaction is expunged out of the mempool because the mempool being congested, or not being included in a block, a transaction not being included in a block, the mechanism is the other way around. You take the fee of a transaction into consideration and the fee of its unconfirmed descendants into consideration. While as a whole, this is a mechanism or an algorithm that incentivizes the miners, but it at times produces surreal results. It's not very precise. It's not very consistent. At times, it might remove a transaction that incentivizes the miners, and at times it might add a transaction that does not incentivize the miner. So to get rid of this concept of cluster mempools is brought into consideration. All right. Currently, there's a limit to the ancestors and descendants that a transaction can have. The unconfirmed ancestors and unconfirmed descendants that a transaction can have, unconfirmed transaction can have in a block or in the mempool, in fact. And the limit is the transaction itself and 24 unconfirmed ancestors, or the transaction itself and 24 unconfirmed descendants, or the transaction including its ascendants should not exceed 101k virtual bytes, or the transaction itself and the descendants should not exceed 101k virtual bytes. So there are 2 restrictions. One is pertaining the number of ancestors and descendants, which should not exceed 25, including the transaction. And the second is stipulated on the basis of the weight. It should not exceed 101k virtual bytes. Now, cluster mempool proposes to get rid of it. All right. The cluster mempool proposes is that all transactions which are related to each other, whether they are ancestors or whether they are descendants, need to be considered as one cluster. So you find all the ancestors, unconfirmed ancestors and unconfirmed descendants of a transaction, and you call them a cluster together. All right, they're 25, they're 50, whatever they are, whatever the size is. All right, and once you have a cluster, you split that cluster into small chunks. You call them chunks. All right, and then you calculate the absolute fee of that chunk, and the chunk that gives the highest benefit or that incentivizes the miners most should be included in the block. So now we are not looking at individual transactions, rather we are looking at chunks altogether. Because when you look at individual transactions, there is a possibility that the transaction in itself might have a very low fee, but it might have an ancestor which has a very high fee. All right, but here we are looking at the transaction in isolation. All right, when they're including it in the block. So it might be possible that when we're including a transaction in the block, we're looking at the ancestor, but the descendant might have a huge fee in the form of CPFP. So we'll not include that transaction, and thus disincentivize the miner. So more logical way of doing this, as per this proposal, is that you take a transaction, you trace all its unconfirmed ascendants, you take ancestors, and you consider all its unconfirmed descendants, and you call that entire thing a cluster. Okay, now that cluster might be very huge in size, so to be rational, you split that cluster into chunks, and you calculate the absolute fee of the entire chunk. All right, you don't consider a transaction in isolation, and the chunk that has the highest absolute fee should be included in the block. This is what the entire proposal is. All right, so it mentions 2 or 3 very important things. First is pinning. What is pinning? Pinning is basically a griefing attack with which you make fee bumping prohibitively high. All right, what you do is, if 2 people own a transaction, all right, and both have the authority to spend that transaction, okay, what one person might do is that one person might bump the fee of the transaction by attaching a child that is low fee but very high in data, so it has a very high absolute fee. All right, so if the other person wants to spend that transaction, he will have to pay a fee higher than the person that's performing the griefing attack. All right, so pinning is basically preventing the other person who also owns a UTXO from getting it mined by making him pay a very high fee. All right, and if they cannot afford the fee, then they cannot spend the transaction. So you basically pin the transaction, and you force them to pay a fee higher than what you have made a bid for. All right, and that can be done by, let's say you have a transaction. Now what you do is you attach 24 descendants to it. Okay, now the transaction already has 24 descendants. All right, now if somebody else wants to spend that transaction and want to bump the fee, they will have to attach a 26 descendant, which they can't do. All right, so the attacker has already attached 24 descendants and put the transaction in the mempool. Now if you want to spend that transaction, you will have to attach a 26 descendant, which you can't do because the limit is 25. Okay, so the attacker has pinned you. You have to wait either till the attacker's you have to wait till the attacker's transaction is mined, because you cannot pay a higher fee than that. So there's this mechanism called CPFP carve out. What it does is that it gives the provision to attach another child to the same transaction to which 24 transactions, let's say, have already been attached. And the purpose of that additional child is only for fee bumping. All right. So if a transaction has 24 descendants, okay, despite that, there is a provision that you can attach another child to it directly, not the 25th descendant, but directly to the parent transaction. And the purpose of that transaction is only to pay a fee. So this is CPFP carve out. All right. Pinning is basically prohibiting people from getting a transaction mined by bumping the fee, and CPFP carve out is like the diagnosis of transaction pinning. It allows you to add one more transaction directly to that unconfirmed parent, only to come out of this pinning attack that you've been subjected to. Now, when we deploy mempools, we don't have ancestors and descendants, right? So you can't keep a track of how many ancestors the transaction has and how many descendants a transaction has. And after 24 descendants, you allow it to add an extra transaction by doing a CPFP carve out, because with cluster mempools, what you are doing is you are getting rid of this ancestor and descendant, and you are just treating the entire related transaction as a cluster, and then you're splitting it into chunks. You don't keep a track of how many ancestors it has and how many descendants it has. So how do you do the CPFP carve out then? The alternative is to get rid of CPFP carve out and to make transactions that for which you feel that a pinning attack might be performed, to make them V3 transaction relay policy compatible. What's a V3 transaction relay compatible transaction? It is a transaction basically which can only have one child. Okay, so let's say you have a commitment transaction, you make it comply with the V3 transaction relay. What's a V3 transaction relay? Basically, up till now, Bitcoin transactions have 2 versions, right? 1 and 2. But they are proposing for it to have a third version as well. Okay, so when you have a third version and the transaction version number is 3, that transaction cannot have more than one child. Okay, so if two people have a UTXO that they own unilaterally, it is not possible for somebody to attach 24 descendants to it and pin it, because that transaction can have only one unconfirmed child. So instead of having this CPFP carve out, the plan is to get rid of CPFP carve out and just make those transactions where you fear pinning, those chunks where you fear pinning, just make them comply with the V3 transaction relay protocol. That is broadly what this proposal is by Sohab Daftar. And I think the post is also very good if anybody would like to go through the post. That is broadly what this talks about. It talks about what transaction pinning is, what CPFP carve out is, what cluster mempools are, what's a cluster mempool, what's a chunk in a cluster mempool, what a V3 transaction relays, and how all of these are related to each other. So any questions or anything to share or anything to ask as we can move ahead?
I think I have a question. So about pinning attack, is it only possible with a multi-sig address? And even then, I think it should be one of two or one of n. Or is there any other scenario where somebody can make a pinning attack?
No, there is another scenario, but I mean, like it basically has to do with ephemeral anchors. Okay, it has to do with ephemeral anchors. Basically, I mean, like in Lightning, on Lightning channels, there's this concept of anchor outputs, where basically what happens is when you establish a Lightning channel, all right, the two peers decide what fee they want to pay when they want to go on it, right? We discussed this in Mastering the Lightning Network on multiple occasions. The fee is decided when you update the state of the channel, all right, for the commitment transaction. Now, you might broadcast the commitment transaction in the future, and it's not possible for you to predict what the fee would be when you're broadcasting that transaction. So generally what happens is a very low fee is stipulated or negotiated upon by both the channel partners, and when they want to go to the main net, there is this anchor output, which is a zero value, zero transaction fee output, which is paid to an obtuse script. All right. So it doesn't have any value, it doesn't have any transaction fee, but the only reason it is there is that you can attach a child to it when you want to broadcast your commitment transaction and bump the fee. Because when you negotiated initially, the fee was very little. Now you see the fee is very little, so you go to the anchor output and you attach a child to that anchor output, and that child has a decent fee. So this is a manner of CPFP. Now, because this anchor output is it pays to an obtuse script, so anybody on the network can unlock it and perform a griefing attack on you. So there is one more mechanism as well, and I think we discussed this in detail as well, I think last week or before that. So yes, performing a griefing attack using anchor outputs is another way through which you can pin a transaction. And the person who's performing this attack has absolutely no control over the UTXOs. He can never get those UTXOs. They are not owned by him. He's just trying to harm the network and its participants. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. Discussion of Miner Extractable Value, MEV, and non-zero ephemeral anchors. Gregory Sanders posted to Delving Bitcoin to discuss concerns about ephemeral anchor outputs that contain more than 0 satoshis. An ephemeral anchor pays to a standardized output script that anyone can spend. One way to use ephemeral anchors would be for them to have 0 output amount, in which is reasonable given that the policy rules for them require that they be accompanied by a child transaction spending the anchor output. However, in the current LN protocol, when a party wants to create an uneconomic HTLC, the payment amount is instead used to overpay the commitment transactions on-chain fees. This is called a trimmed HTLC. If HTLC trimming is done in a commitment transaction using ephemeral anchors, it could be profitable for a miner to confirm the commitment transaction without a child transaction that spends the ephemeral anchor output. Once a commitment transaction is confirmed, there's no incentive for anyone to spend a 0 amount ephemeral anchor output, meaning it will consume space and full node UTXO sets forever, an undesirable output. A proposed alternative is to put the trimmed HTLC amounts into the value of the ephemeral anchor outputs. That way, they incentivize confirming both the commitment transactions and a spend of the ephemeral anchor output. In its post, Sanders analyzes this possibility and finds that this can create several security problems. These can be solved by miners analyzing transactions, determining when it will be profitable for them to spend an ephemeral anchor output themselves, and creating necessary transaction. This is a type of miner extractable value, MEV. Several alternative solutions were also proposed. Only relaying transactions that are fully miner incentive compatible If anyone attempts to spend an ephemeral anchor in a way that doesn't maximize revenue for a miner, that transaction would not be relayed by Bitcoin Core. Burn trimmed value. Instead of turning the amount of trimmed HTLCs into fees, the amount would instead be spent to an up-return output, destroying those Satoshis by making them permanently unspendable. This would only happen if a commitment transaction containing a trimmed HTLC was put on chain. Normally, trimmed HTLCs are resolved off-chain and their value is successfully transferred from one party to the other. Ensure LED transactions propagate easily. Instead of having miners run special code that maximizes their value, ensure that transactions maximizing their value propagate easily through the network. That way, one can run the LED code and relay the results to miners in a way that ensures all miners and relay nodes can obtain the same set of transactions. Okay, so broadly what this talks about is what are uneconomic HTLCs, okay, or what are uneconomic transactions in Bitcoin. An uneconomic transaction in Bitcoin is a transaction where the fee is higher than the value of the UTXO that you are trying to spend. Okay, let's say you're trying to spend 10,000 Satoshis, but the fee is 20,000 Satoshis. So that is an uneconomic transaction in Bitcoin. Okay, now when two Lightning channel partners establish a channel, they also negotiate the dust value, meaning the minimum value that a transaction or output should have in order for it to be broadcasted to the network. Okay, if the value is below that, then that is an uneconomic HTLC. Okay, that will not be broadcasted to the network. Now, just now we covered pinning, right? Pinning attacks. What do you do to tackle pinning attacks? You have ephemeral anchors and you have CPFP mechanism. All right. So here's another proposal. Okay, the proposal is that in a commitment transaction, if you have uneconomic HTLCs, meaning outputs that have so little value that there's no point spending them and you cannot spend them, what you can do is you can transfer the value of those HTLCs, which are referred to as trimmed HTLCs because they're very little value, as a fee to the miner, okay, who is trying to mine the ephemeral anchor. So instead of attaching the child to an ephemeral anchor, you pass the value in that trimmed HTLC to the ephemeral anchor. So the miner is incentivized to mine that ephemeral anchor, and also you save data and space by not having to attach a child transaction to the ephemeral anchor. So this is basically what the proposal is, that you just spend that trimmed HTLC to the anchor output so that the miners are incentivized to mine that anchor output transaction, which initially was a zero output and zero transaction fee anchor output, which was just used for the purpose of fee bumping. So instead of attaching a child to bump the fee, you just transfer the value of those trimmed HTLCs to that anchor output to incentivize the miners. Okay. And like there was discussion going around it, how to optimize this process, and these were the three like prominent suggestions that came. Only relaying transactions that are fully miner incentive compatible if anyone attempts to spend an ephemeral anchor in a way that doesn't maximize revenue for miner. Meaning it should, a mechanism should be in a place that only a miner should be able to leverage from the value that has been transferred from the trimmed HTLCs and nobody else. So a mechanism should be in place to ensure that only miners get that money and nobody else. Like for instance, the Coinbase transaction, nobody else can claim it. It's only the miner that gets it, right? So there should be a mechanism to ensure that the value that is being transferred from the trimmed HTLCs should only be leveraged by the miners. The second option was that to burn these HTLCs. These dust outputs, just to burn them. All right, to continue using the child outputs, and these HTLCs, if they're getting wasted, just to burn those HTLCs. And another proposal was that these transactions should miners should not have to run any special code like currently miners have a separate software that they run, which is referred to as FIBO, which has very low latency. So these transactions should be optimized in a manner that even the regular node should be able to relay them to the miners instead of the miners having to rely on special or specific code. These were some proposals given. So broadly what this covers is that the HTLC, which is trimmed, which has an output which is lesser than the dust value, the value in it should be transferred to the anchor output, and it should be given as a fee to the miner in order to incentivize him to mine that transaction. And these are some protocols or some rules and regulations that must be followed to ensure that the process goes through successfully, and the miners are informed immediately regarding the presence of such transactions, and also the value in those transactions are only leveraged by the miners. We're done with the news section. Anything anybody has to say? We'll try and wind up whatever is remaining in 10 minutes, but anything?
One was about the arithmetic operations proposal. So you said that it's for any mathematical operations that might need to get performed on Satoshis, is it? The amount of value in the UTXO. So what is the use case of that? If I understand it correctly.
The use case is just allowing arithmetic operations of a higher value of like values that overflow in a 32-bit integer. That's it. No other use case. Just like an operating system would upgrade from 32 bits to 64 bits to ensure that larger arithmetic operations can be performed of larger values. That's the only proposal. Currently, the opcodes support 32 bits, and the proposal is to upgrade it to 64 bits to perform larger arithmetic operations in the future.
Right. So it's not just for the number of Satoshis, it's for the number of bytes or bits in the transaction.
Right.
Okay. Understood.
Right.
Got it.
And this, I mean, there's a very nice explanation by Chris Stewart. If you go through it, currently obviously it's outside the purview of the session, but it's a very good explanation if you go through it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah, this one. Okay, you can go through. All right, so we'll go into the release and release candidates. LDK 0.0.119 is a new release of this library for building LN-enabled applications. Multiple new features are added, including receiving payments to multi-hop blinded parts, along with multi-bug fixes and other improvements. So LDK's new release version is such and such. Okay, what it does is that it adds a new feature, which is it supports blinded parts now. What are blinded parts? Blinded parts are basically names for techniques that allow an LN node to send a payment to an unannounced node without learning where the node is in the network, topology, or what channels it shares with other nodes. So it's basically the path is blinded. Generally, I mean, if channels are announced, the sender's node knows what the path is, right? We covered this in mastering the Lightning Network. What is path finding? What is routing? Okay, so who finds the path? It's the node of the initiator of the payment that finds the path. And the node needs to know the entire path, and for that, the entire path needs to consist of announced channels. That blinded path is a mechanism through which it's possible for you to route payments through nodes that are unannounced. So you don't exactly know the network topology, you don't exactly know which node is at what position. Okay, but you're still able to reach your destination because there are nodes that connect you to your destination, and even though they are unannounced, you are able to do that, and that is why they refer to as blinded paths. Okay.
So I think during the pathfinding process, you're not even aware that that node is part of the path, but you're able to still route through it.
Yeah, in blinded paths. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Maybe if node A sends the payments to node B, and node B is in contact with node C, and node C is not announced, then maybe because node B and node C know each other and they have a connection with each other, they trust each other. So even if node C is not unannounced, it's ready to route the payments.
No, I think it's not that obvious, because the problem with that is that node A, while sending a payment to node E, will need to know about node B, C, D, which is the path to node E. So if one of the nodes is unannounced, then node A cannot find that path. Correct?
Yes, but that is like the general mechanism. That's why we have this blinded paths thing, which like overcomes that problem of your node having to know the entire path. Otherwise, we don't need blinded path, right?
Right. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So notable code and documentation changes. All right. Bitcoin Core PR number 2905. It is a preparation step to activate version 2 P2P transport. That's BIP 324 by default. This patch adds V2 transport support for connect, add node, and seed node configuration arguments. If V2 transport is enabled and reconnects with V1 if the peer does not support V2. Additionally, this update adds a column displaying the transport protocol version to the NetInfo peer connection Bitcoin CLI dashboard. So this talks about BIP 24 that we've discussed in detail on many occasions at Bitshala, courtesy Status Quo. We even had a BitDev session on it in person, and we've had 2 BitDev sessions on it conducted on Jitsi. So what BIP 34 broadly tries to attain is that it encrypts the transactions that the messages that are exchanged between nodes on the Bitcoin network. So what this PR does is that it's a preparation in a step to activate version P2P transport. So it's a preparation in a step to activate BIP324 by default. What it does is that these are three RPC commands, okay? Connect, add node, seed node. Okay, they're self-explanatory. This basically connects you with a specific peer. This add node basically it adds the addresses of multiple nodes in your address manager to connect to, and seed node basically queries the DNS for a specific node. So these messages for now can be passed or exchanged between nodes using encryption. So if your node supports the V2 transport protocol, it will establish connection with another node that supports the V2 transport protocol, and they can exchange these connect or add node or C node messages, which are encrypted, which kind of tackles the man in the middle attack. And what if the node does not support V2 transport? Then it goes back to the default V1 transport, and the messages are not shared with the nodes in an encrypted manner. Okay, and it also gives us additionally, this update adds a column displaying the transport protocol version. So there's a column that's been added to the Bitcoin CLI dashboard that gives you an overview of which nodes you are connected with over V2 and which nodes you are connected to over V1. That is what this pull request talks about. Okay, and the next one is 29200, which allows I2P network support to use connections encrypted using ECIES X25519 and Al-Jamal types 4 and 0 respectively. This allows to connect to I2P peers of either type, and the newer, faster ECIES X25519 will be preferred. What's I2P network? It's internet, what is it? Project. Invisible Internet Project. Yeah, it's the Invisible Internet Project. It's basically a network on which participants can communicate with each other while remaining anonymous and masking their IP addresses. Very similar to the concept of Tor, where nodes communicate with each other anonymously by masking their IP addresses. Okay, so what this proposal does is that it allows nodes to connect with each other over the I2P network. All right, so the IP address of your node will remain anonymous, and all the nodes basically that use this network to communicate with each other, their IP addresses will remain anonymous. And to do this, they use these two cryptographic algorithms: ECIES X25519. Just like we have ECDSA, we also have an ECIES. And just like we have a SEC P256K1 curve, we also have an X25519 curve. So this algorithm ECIES is applied on this curve X25519. And there's a second cryptographic algorithm that also does what ECIES does. It's called Al-Jamal. It's named after an Egyptian cryptographer, Tahir Al-Jamal, who's the inventor of this algorithm. Now, these algorithms have multiple variants. So type 4 of ECIES and type 0 of Al-Jamal. All right, so these two cryptographic algorithms are used on this network over this curve, which facilitate communication between nodes in an anonymous manner, masking their IP addresses. So if two nodes want to leverage it and remain anonymous while running their Bitcoin nodes, they can use I2P network now, which was not possible earlier. And out of these two algorithms, what is suggested is that ICES is preferred. Is the newer one, is the faster one. Okay. Now this one is PR28890. It removes the RPC serial version configuration parameter that was previously deprecated. See newsletter 269. This option was introduced during the transition to version V0. That's the first version of SegWit, to allow older programs to continue to access blocks and transactions in strip format without any SegWit fields. At this point, all programs should be updated to handle SegWit transactions, and this option should no longer be needed. What's RPC serial version? Basically, it's a configuration parameter. Like, you have multiple configuration parameters in your bitcoin.conf file, where you can decide whether you want the node to be a full node or a clone node, what's your RPC username, what's your RPC password, what network are you running your node on, SIGNet, testnet, mainnet. There's also configuration RPC serial version, which basically determines whether your node is compatible with SegWit or it's not compatible with SegWit. All right. So if your node is not compatible with SegWit, the SegWit specific data will not be passed by your node. All right. This was done to ensure backward compatibility between the nodes that support SegWit and the nodes that don't support SegWit. But there is not a need of that anymore, as the overwhelming majority of nodes today, if not all, do support SegWit. So this RPC serial version, which was deprecated, has now been removed because there are no relevant nodes that currently do not support SegWit. Then the next one is Eclair number 2808 updates the open command with a funding fee budget Satoshi parameter that defines the maximum amount the node is willing to pay in on-chain fees to open a channel. With the default set to 0.1% of the amount paid into the channel, Eclair will try to pay a lower fee if possible, but it will pay up to the budgeted amount if necessary. The RBF open command is also updated to accept the same parameter which defines the maximum amount to spend on RBF fee bumping. So what basically Eclair has done is that it has introduced a command, all right, funding fee budget satoshis, which allows you to set an upper threshold for the amount of fee that you are willing to pay to open a channel. Okay, and I mean there are multiple wallets that already have this in place. Phoenix is one that I tried using I think a couple of weeks ago, and I think it sets a high limit of 25%. Okay, the default in Eclair is 0.1%. You can extend that as well. I think the highest limit in Phoenix goes up to 25%. So if you're opening a channel, let's say, and you're supplying a liquidity of 1 Bitcoin, you cannot pay a fee that is greater than 0.25 BTC to get that transaction confirmed in a 2 of 2 multi-sig address. And here the default is 0.1. So every time you go, like when you intend to initiate a channel and you provide liquidity to the 2 of 2 multi-signature wallet, that transaction cannot, I mean, the fee that you pay by default cannot exceed 0.1% of the actual liquidity that you are providing to the channel. And the same goes when you decide to furnish either your commitment transaction or mutually decide to close the channel. Now, there's one more thing that is introduced. The RBF open command is also updated to accept the same parameter which defines the maximum amount to spend on RBF bumping. All right. Now, it also gives you a provision to bump the fee. All right. And how do you bump the fee? You can set aside certain sats which as reserves, which will only be used for bumping the fee. And for that also the default is 0.1%. So when you open the channel, the default value is 0.1%. That is, you cannot pay more than 0.1% in fee of the entire channel liquidity to open the channel. And when you're going on the mainnet, again, the default is 0.1%. You cannot pay more than 0.1% to go back on net. There's a provision to bump the fee, and that bumping fee is again for the 0.1%. So that makes it 0.2%. That is a feature that is added in Eclair, which is there in some wallets already. Now, LND number 8188 adds several new RPCs for quickly obtaining debugging information, encrypting it to a public key, and decrypting it given a private key. As the PR explains, the idea is that we would publish a public key in the GitHub issue template and would ask users to run the LNCLI encrypt debug package command and upload the encrypted output files to the GitHub issue, provide us with the information we normally require to debug user problems. Now, this is the issue that we commenced today's session with. When I asked why is it that Lightning developers don't talk about vulnerabilities when they are found, rather they fix those vulnerabilities. Even after those vulnerabilities are fixed, they don't immediately talk about it. They talk about it sometime in the future when they are 100% sure that those vulnerabilities cannot be exploited. Because if they beat the trumpets about those vulnerabilities, the moment they find them in public, there is a high probability that an adversary will try to exploit those vulnerabilities. Now, what has been proposed is that by the LND developers is that, let's say you are running an LND node, you come across a bug, right? You detect a bug, and generally in a software where you detect a bug, there is a mechanism that that bug is displayed to you in a human readable language in your terminal, which we refer to as logs. So all of us, whenever we write code, we get errors all the time, and those errors are seen in the terminal, right? There's a mechanism for those errors to be published in your terminal, which is referred to as logs in human readable language. So you understand exactly where you went wrong and you can fix it, right? Now, if something goes wrong with your node, it's not always the case that you'll be able to fix it. You might need to convey to the LND developers. What LND developers are proposing is that they will put a public key on the GitHub, okay? So whenever the LND node runner comes across a bug, okay, or a vulnerability, what they can do is they can use those logs as the message and use that public key to sign that log and encrypt that log, okay? And that encrypted log, they can share it with the LND developers, and the private key to decrypt that log is only with the LND developers. So in this way, if a user comes across a bug or a vulnerability, he can confidentially by encryption share that bug or vulnerability with the LND developers who have the private key to decrypt it. They will decrypt it and they will solve it. So what this can do is this can because basically, if you come across a vulnerability, you might not necessarily know a Lightning developer in person, right? How do you find a Lightning developer in person? You might not be able to do that. So now is a mechanism that every LND developer every LND node runner can reach out to an LND developer and share a bug or a vulnerability that they have experienced in their node in an encrypted format, and they can decrypt it, so thereby maintaining privacy. This one says LND 8096 adds a fee spike buffer in the current LN protocol. The party who single funded a channel is responsible for paying any on-chain fees directly included in the commitment transaction and the pre-signed HTLC success and HTLC timeout transactions, that is HTLCX transactions. If the funding party is low on funds in the channel and if fee rates rise, the funding party may not be able to accept a new incoming payment because they don't have enough funds to pay for its fees. This is despite the fact that an incoming payment would increase the funding party's balance if the payment settles. To avoid this type of stuck channel problem, a recommendation in Bolt 2 that is added several years ago in Bolt's number 740 suggests the funder voluntarily keeps an extra reserve of funds to ensure an additional payment can be received even if fee rates rise. LND now implements this solution, which is also implemented by Core Lightning and Eclair. So basically what this does is that, let's say an LND node runner wants to go on chain, okay, but he doesn't have adequate money to pay for the fee, all right? So what this does is basically this allows you to reserve certain sats to pay the fee in the future, which is referred to as fee spike buffer. So even if you don't have adequate liquidity in the channel, I mean, you're not willing to pay a higher fee, you have a reserve which you can go back to and spike your fee and get your transaction on the mainnet. The final one is LND number 8095 and number 8142 add additional logic to parts of LND's code base for handling blinded paths. So blinded paths, they are either proposed or they already exist. Which is covered blinded paths, right? Yeah, so blinded paths are now supported by LDK and LND as well. So what they've done is they've added additional logic to parts of LND's code base for handling blinded paths. So basically they've added some new code which optimizes their software to handle blinded paths in a better way than it used to before. This is part of ongoing work to add full support for blinded paths to LND. So there's no full support right now. They've added some code towards achieving their eventual goal of gaining a full support. We've come to the end of the newsletter. So yeah, guys, any questions or anything that you'd like to share, please go ahead.
What's blinded paths? Did you cover that?
Blinded paths are basically they allow you to route a payment even if there is an unannounced node in the path.
Got it.
So if you're routing a payment channel from A to B, B to C, C to C, C to D, D to E, your eventual destination is D, right? But let's say C is an unannounced node and you don't know it. Despite that, because that node helps you reach your eventual destination, you'll be able to route your payment through that node, obviously with its consent, but you will not get any information about who that node is or where exactly is that node in the path. That node will remain anonymous.
Got it. There's a lot of material to be covered in every Optech session. Like it's more than 1 hour of material.
The podcast that happens, I mean, like all of us here are, I mean, we will discuss among ourselves, we're exploring, right? But generally the podcast that happens, I mean, these like pro developers come over there and they know everything in and out, but generally they take 90 minutes to 100 minutes every week. If you go to the podcast, this newsletter, like we discussed, even the people who proposed them, there was Brandon Black in this week's discussion. There was Matt Morehouse in this week's discussion. All these people, there was Chris Stewart, I think Sohas was there. All these guys were there who have come up with these proposals, and the minimum they gave is 90 to 100 minutes. So this week's was really very exhaustive. So I had to go a little fast as well, and I apologize for that. But yeah, a lot of things to come, a lot of things to learn as well. It's fun. I thoroughly enjoy going through these letters. They acquaint you with so much because generally there's so much of noise on social media. This is like very well filtered, very well curated, surveyed and monitored by experts, like given to you so that you don't have to search for a lot of noise and waste a lot of time on the internet. You have all relevant material, all relevant happenings that happened in the world of Bitcoin in the past 7 days or 14 days. They're all at your disposal.
And that's the best part. I wish there was a way for us to slow down and cover the material, because at times, at times I could not follow your train of thought, and that's okay because we have limited time. But like, yeah, I'm not sure. Probably I should cover the material beforehand, uh, because some parts, for example,
Exactly.
especially gets
Yeah.
missed.
So they can be two alternatives. I think maybe you, me, and Raj can discuss. One alternative could be that we only cover the news section, maybe, or we only cover, because news section is there always. These things might be, might not be. So maybe we can cover only the news section if you want to give it adequate time. And the second one would be like, yeah, I mean, me and Raj even had this discussion that this is not a reading session, right? Like in reading sessions, most of us generally, we might come prepared, we might not come prepared. We'll get the gist of what's being said. But in these sessions, if you don't read and come, then you'll probably not be able to grab more than 10 to 20% of what's being said.
Yep.
At least like you have to go through the newsletter and give it 30, 45 minutes, whatever you can on the surface level. Only then will you be able to leverage from these sessions. If you and I just open the computer or the laptop, it's very difficult for us to go through anything or understand anything.
Absolutely. I think that's pre-reading is required. Unlike Bitcoin Wednesday reads, pre-reading is required for this Optech sessions.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I really enjoyed how you explained everything in such a simple language. Like,
Yup,
it
that's
was
the
really
great.
nice.
That's the
We
best part.
enjoyed listening to it. Like, you can really host the session well.
I'm coming from you, Shadiswa. Thanks a lot. I mean, it means a lot to me. Coming from you, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And sorry for not allowing most of you to speak because I had to cover. I mean, I thought that if we are here in the session, it's important to cover. So, the sessions I try and do it this way. Like anytime you want to interrupt, just interrupt, because there are so many things to cover. If every 4 minutes, 5 minutes, I stop and ask people, if you have any questions, we'll not be able to cover it in 1 hour. So anytime anybody wants to chime in, just interrupt me.
Yeah, no worries at all. And also, I think like at least developers find the code and documentation changes useful too, because I remember Anmol talking in the channel about the RPC serial version deprecation problem. Is Anmol still here? Oh, he's gone. Yeah, he was asking a few weeks. Maybe last week he was asking about this command
Yes,
gone.
I remember. Yeah, then he said it's deprecated. Now it's removed. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, so it's useful for us to see this.
Exactly. This is very beneficial. Yeah.
Thanks for hosting.
You're welcome. So if nothing else to say, we'll all sign off.
Yep. Thanks, Fazil.
All right. You're welcome. Bye everyone. Thanks everyone for showing up, and bye. Good night.
Bye.